I wanted to cover a few aspects of this engine that may help you set it up. You may know some of this, but I'm just going to cover everything, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you. First thing I'm going to talk about is the throttle cable. There's a mounting bracket in the middle of the motor here. The stock 914 cable will come up and go through that and hook to the bell crank linkage. This is just sort of arbitrarily made. You may have to tweak it or bend it a little bit to get the angles right or to get the length right. I've also noticed that the cable usually comes through a hole in the tin on the far side of the motor here, but on these carburetor installs I usually find it's better to come up through the or between the engine tin and the body. There's the seal just at the front, in front of the fan, and just kind of snake it up through there. There's no hole or anything, but just push it in between the two there. And that puts it at a little better angle coming in, and helps it reach a little better. So it'll come up from up here and run through into this bracket, and then there's a barrel nut on the end. If you find that the barrel nut doesn't quite fit, or doesn't quite line up with the solid portion of the cable, you can move the bracket, bend it a little bit. You can make adjustments on the cable mounting, the number of nuts, or if you put washers on the back side. You can also adjust the length of that at the pedal sometimes as well too. There's some adjustment there. So if it doesn't quite fit perfectly, take a look at those things or get in touch with me and I can talk you through some of those other steps. At some point you're going to have to deal with syncing the carburetors, and that's all handled through the rods of the bell crank linkage. The nice part about this is because these rods are directly linked, you only need to move one. So one of them can stay locked and solid as it is, and just make adjustments on the other one. One side is left hand thread, one side is right hand thread, so that when you turn it, it'll get shorter or longer. So if you're making adjustments there, just loosen both of the lock nuts, twist this in and out, and then lock it when you're done. You also want to make sure to check it at idle, where nothing's touching anything, as well as off idle. So you want to crack the throttle just a bit. You're going to be using this type of synchrometer. You're going to want to ideally get two of them, so that you can check two throats at the same time, or you can check both sides without having to move 1 meter back and forth between the two while trying to hold the RPM constant, that sort of thing. These air cleaners take a 4mm hex, and just unscrew. I've added a couple of standoff tubes inside so that the top can't crush down when these come. You could just keep tightening this forever and completely crush the air filter element. So just be aware when you're taking it apart that there are some extra kind of loose pieces inside there. They're not really going to go anywhere. It'd be pretty hard for you to get them stuck down in the motor or anything, but these loose tubes, just be aware of them. So these are your throats. You're going to want to, when you're syncing it, you need to start with just one carburetor, and you'd put your two synchrometers on there while the engine's idling. You want to make sure that before you get to any of this, if you're going to resync the carburetors or check the sync on the carburetors, you need to make sure that it's completely warmed up. The engine will expand as it heats up, and that expansion will change because the sync and the settings of the carburetors, because these are going to move farther apart from the bell crank, and that's going to just impact the geometry of everything. So let it get completely warm. Ideally go for a drive, and then do it when you come back. You also want to make sure that all of the sort of engine settings are set correctly before you start syncing the carburetor. So things like valve adjustment, and engine timing, even changing the oil, all of that stuff. You know, as you do this periodically, it's kind of a good thing to change the oil, set the valves, do that tune-up, go for a drive, get it all warm, come back, check the sync on the idle with everything hot, make any adjustments that need to be, and this is your sort of twice a year tune-up kind of, you know, once at the beginning of the season and once midway through, just to make sure everything's running where it should be. So once you've got everything warmed up and you're actually getting to the sink, you'll have the engine idling, hot, sitting there. Just put one throat or one meter on each throat and just read the numbers. This red line will move up. When I had it set, it was somewhere around 6, between 6 and 7, but it needs to be wherever it needs to be. You may need to, slightly higher idle on this motor because of the lightened flywheel. Doesn't have as much mass to help cycle through when the RPMs get lower. I had it set around 1,000, I think, and it seemed pretty good there, so that should probably be what you're shooting for. If these individual throats are off, you want to check, like I said, check both of these, and there's a small lock nut. It's got a 8mm hex wrench is what you would use to loosen it. Those lock nuts have little screws in the middle. The more you back that out, the more air is let in for each throat. There's an upper limit to that, and if the throttle plates are open farther, those adjustments can have less of an impact because they're fairly small holes. So if you're already letting a bunch of air past the throttle plate by having this throttle stop screw open and the RPM higher, these small adjustments on the side will have less of an impact. But that's your approach to sort of making one carb work or matched to itself. So the idea is to get these two throats matched up and synced together, happy and perfect, using these small lock nut screws on the side. Then go to the other side, get those synced. But don't try to match this with that yet. Just do this one, do that one. Don't pay attention to how they work together. Just make sure those two are working right. Once you've got those two set to each other, you want to pop one side of the linkage off. There's a small locking pin. You need to kind of hook that, flip it up, pull it out. Don't lose that, and then it'll just pop off. So get that popped off like that. Yeah, sure. There we go. Maybe not that one. Get that loosened up, so now you have no interference from one carb to the other. Should still be idling. You may want to turn it off to pop that off. I find it frustrating to be trying to pop this off and the motor's revving and everything's going everywhere. So you should be able to get it restarted, you know, shut it off, pop this off, turn the key and have it restart, even though you won't be able to use the throttle to open both carburetors. With this off, they're not tied together. Now you can start checking one side to the other. In this scenario, you'd be just wanting to adjust the throttle stop screws to make sure that those are in the same place. So you'd be searching to get the correct idle RPM between the two, but not necessarily the same airflow. No, that's not right. You want the same airflow. Set the same airflow with throttle stop screws. Once your throttle stop screws are synced, then you can reconnect the linkage, and ideally reconnecting the linkage doesn't change those numbers. If it changes those numbers, then your linkage is interfering with the full idle sync, and at that point you want to loosen these small stop screws or stop nuts on the linkage piece on one side, make adjustments until those two read back to what they were before and equal on both carburetors. Once that's complete, you should kind of just finger tighten these lock screws and then just open slightly. You know, like I said, you'll be at idle somewhere in the 6 to 7 range. I usually open this up till it hits 10 or 20 and make sure at that 10 or 20 that it's 10 or 20 on both sides, because what you'll find is there's a sort of a wide range. There's almost one full thread of adjustment in this linkage rod where the idle adjustment is correct. So anywhere within that full thread turn is all correct at idle. So if that full thread turn becomes where you're syncing the off idle, because when you're off idle, you're taking all of the slop out, that when you're at idle, everything's just loose. You put a little pressure on it, everything kind of tightens up, everything moves. And so you can then just holding that slightly open, shooting for a specific number, with a meter on both sides. Make those adjustments, check it back at idle, check it back above, back and forth until you get both to be working correctly. Lock those down. Now all your airflows are synced. You should also periodically check float height adjustment. There's a couple of brass jets in between the throats here. Unscrew one of those and you can use a caliper, but just pull that jet completely out. It's about a few inches long. Pull that out, set it aside, do just one jet on both carburetors, and then use this portion, plunge down. You'll need a flashlight. It's one of those you're trying to look in there and get the tool in there and use a flashlight to see. You're really looking for the sort of meniscus of the fuel that you'll see right down in that hole. You want to drop this down until you can see that meniscus change, meaning that this end has touched the fluid. So you can just see, you'll see sort of a reflection, and as you push this down into the hole, you're going to be watching that fluid and it'll all of a sudden just wobble, and that means that this is touched. So you just stop there, read the number, make sure they're both the same on both sides. It's not super uncommon, hopefully it won't happen in this case, but it's not super uncommon for the jostling of the truck driving along with this engine on a pallet to bounce. They drive over speed bumps at full speed, the whole thing bounces. That can upset the float levels. So you'll need to kind of check that when you get it. Most people recommend taking the cover off and measuring the float. You can find all that stuff online, and that's how it's adjusted. But I've found that measuring it directly with the fuel pump running but with the engine off, to make sure everything's filled up and full and settled, I find that to be a little more accurate because you're measuring it directly and you're making sure you're seeing the effect. Whereas the measurement, you don't know exactly how it is. So when I first set these up, when I got the carburetors, I set them by the measurement, put them on here, and this one was almost 7 millimeters lower than this one. So just setting them by eye can have a big difference between the two, and those float levels have a big impact on how the engine runs. So you want to get those as synced as possible. Once you get that all complete, you're going to throw the filter back on. There's a metal pleat in the filter. I usually just try to shoot that on the back just because of aesthetics. But it takes a little fiddling to kind of shove that into place. And then you got the whole balance project of getting these screws and the tubes and everything in here all at once. Again, they're not going to go anywhere, so I'm just going to hold kind of everything together, drop it into place, and then just let those tubes go, pull my fingers out, start working that filter into the top plate, and just kind of work my way around, get that to snap into place. A little twisting can help. And then sometimes these screws like to get a little bit cockeyed. It's kind of hard to see because there's such a short angle there, but what you want to do is just put your wrench in there, and you can just kind of lift or twist, and that will sort of realign things. You'll be able to feel it kind of snap into place, and then you're good to go. And then with those tubes in there that I added, you can just crank down on that and crank down on both of them, and you're not going to crush the filter. The idle mixture screws on the side, this is, controls the amount of fuel only at idle. As soon as you come off idle, these have almost no effect on anything. Out is more fuel, in is less fuel. These are the ones with little springs, and they have knurl on the outside so that you can kind of grip it, but they're a flathead screw. Those are all set at, I think, 2 full turns out right now. You may need to tweak with those a little bit, especially if you put it on a dyno where they have oxygen sensor on the exhaust. You can really dial those in. That jet that I talked about pulling out earlier, the long one, that's also where your main jets are, and the air correction jets. So when they're doing the dyno tuning, those are the pieces that they're going to be swapping. And then on the outside, there's a couple of brass screws just underneath the fuel line on either side. There's 4 of them. Those are where the idle jets are sitting. Those are good to know where they are because it's not super uncommon for carbureted cars to get a bit of rust from the tank or some other contaminant through the system, even if you have a filter and plug an idle jet. So if you start having a really stumbly idle, wobbling, like one cylinder's not running, one of the first checks is to pull all the idle jets and look for foreign matter blocking those small orifices. And then again, when you're dyno tuning, these are the ones that you would change. These idle jets are pretty much related, again, just to idle. So without touching the linkage, these idle mixture screws, if you have to go out too far, you're needing too much fuel, so you need a bigger jet. And then bring the screws back in and kind of recheck everything. If everything's running rich and you start tightening down these screws and you get to where they're only just slightly off, you need a smaller idle jet to bring the whole thing down and then reset and go from there. Main jets and air correction jets all handled everything off idle, so everything from about 2,000 up, about 2,000 to 4,000, 5,000 RPM is where the main jet does most of the work. Above 4,000, 5,000 RPM is where the air correction really starts to come in. But there's a crossover point. A whole bunch of things go into changing those factors. But those are the areas where you're going to be making adjustments on the carburetor. The fuel pump I'm sending is internally regulated to the correct pressure, so you don't need an external regulator. Just hook up that fuel pump, run the outlet side directly to this. If you still have 2 fuel lines connected from the original fuel injection setup, just block off the return line side. You'll want to get that right because the supply line side has a filter sock inside the tank. That extra level of filtering is beneficial. So if you choose the wrong one, you can be allowing debris into your system. Again, filters don't always take care of everything. I didn't get a filter. You'll need to get one. I can recommend some if you want to. There's one from 1 Europe Boxster. It's a nice big filter, so it'll last a long time. It's got the correct 5/16 nipples on either side, so you can just put it right inside of the fuel line. Pretty easy. You can get that number from me. All right, this 123 ignition distributor, it's all handled electronically. So normally you would loosen the lock screw and twist this back and forth to set the timing. That's only handled with the 123 ignition for initial setup. At this point it's set, but this is also something that you should just kind of confirm. You're going to have an app on your phone that will tell you what timing the distributor is providing at that point. So you can go in with a timing light with the engine running, pull this off, check the timing. You'll want an adjustable timing light. So it should be at idle reading about 12 degrees. Set up your timing light, check this, set 12 on your timing light, look for the 0 mark on the flywheel or on the fan. Make sure that when the phone app is telling you 12 degrees, that you're also seeing 12 degrees in reality. That means the two are synced. If you loosen this and twist it, you could be, the sort of distributor could be thinking it's giving you 12 degrees, but you check this and it's actually giving you 14. Everything's wrong, everything's shifted by 2 degrees. So you need to get those synced right from the beginning. That's been done, shouldn't need to do it. I don't expect that to ever be an issue, but you should know about it. You should probably check it that at least once a year during your tune-up process. Just make sure that that's still synced. That app will let you assign the distributor curve, so when you're dyno tuning, they can fiddle with those ignition settings, and you can make a lot of tuning progress there. Right now it's set to what typically works for most motors and a pretty good setup, but there's always room for improvement that has to be done for that specific motor, because every compression ratio is different, every airflow is different for different carb setups and manifolds, and all that stuff affects how the ignition timing, what is ideal for the ignition timing. The distributor has a ground wire that's to a small nut on the side here. It has that one's blue, I think. There's a black wire that goes to the negative side of the coil, red wire that goes to the positive side of the coil. When you hook up your wiring in the car, you'll have two wires in that harness that's connecting to the coil. Sometimes those can be very confusing about which one's which. You know, on early cars, the tack wire is black with purple, which is really hard to see, especially if it's covered in oil, and the coil power wire is black. So those are kind of hard to differentiate. On later cars, the tack wire I think is just solid black, but is smaller than the coil wire, which is also solid black but fatter. What I usually do when I'm setting it up, just because I prefer to take the safest route possible to not blow things up, like blowing up this $500 distributor, hook up just one of those wires. And ideally take a multimeter, turn the key on, probe those harness wires, body harness wires, and see which one has power. With the key on, the one with power will go to the positive side, the other one is for the tack. And I even go so far as to just leave the tack unhooked until I'm sure that everything's running, and then I can just make that one connection, and I'm positive that it's all hooked up correctly. But the power supply, key on, power, goes to the red positive side. The tack wire goes to the negative side. The spark plug wires are MSD wires that I made. They're using NGK end plugs. Those stay nice and tight to the tin, which we kind of need with these short manifolds and carburetors getting in the way. You will find that pulling these off is a bit of a pain. Getting to the spark plugs, especially on the front sides, cylinders 2 and 4, getting those spark plugs out can be a pain because of the access with these short manifolds and these carburetors in the way. You may find, you probably will find, that you need to buy a few different spark plug sockets and then find the one that fits, because it's just a tight squeeze, and different manufacturers have different tolerances for their spark plug sockets. There's one by, I think, Gear Wrench that is magnetic, which is nice because it holds the spark plug in place, and the extension is built into it so it can't separate. And that was the problem that I had when I was trying to, when I was first putting the spark plugs in with everything assembled, was my socket popped off and it was loose in there, and I had to get pliers and try and fiddle, and that was a pain. So that Gear Wrench one may work better. I don't have mine anymore, even though I'm talking about it, and I need to get another one. So I can't say for sure that it's gonna be a perfect setup. It may actually not work with these, but if it does work, that's the greatest setup. I need to get another one of those. But just be ready for those to be kind of a fight. You won't have to do it too much, but again, if you find the right socket for it, you can make your life much easier. And you'll just have to keep that socket with this motor, and that's just the way it is. We talked a little bit about the breather setups. I was talking about a breather box. Shortly after I sent you that email, I got to looking at the factory manuals and sort of how the breather system was designed to work. There are ports just next to the carburetors. On this 1-2 side, it's at the forward edge where I'm touching here. On 3-4, it's on the back side here by the flywheel. Those have been capped. Keep an eye on those in case those caps deteriorate or crack or pop free. You can just start getting, it's not going to make the engine run funny, but you'll get some oil starting to come out of there, and it can make a mess. So it's just nice to stay on top of that. The confusion that I was talking about when I first emailed was usually I've taken these two ports as well as the port here on the oil fill, tied those all together into a box, and ran it that way. Upon researching the factory manuals, I realized that these ports were part of the crankcase breather setup that was designed for this port to go to the central vacuum manifold of the fuel injection. So this had suction on it full time, and these ports were actually installed to allow air from the air filters to come in the engine at the head, flow down to the crankcase and be sucked out. So it was actually increasing the amount of air that was flowing through the crankcase to help suck out moisture and condensation. Since we don't have this connected to a manifold source, because we don't really have a manifold source, these ports become unnecessary. They're all sort of exit ports, and we don't need 3 exit ports. So these become just extra plumbing. So I have these capped off. This is the only one you need. Right now I'm shipping it with a tube to just drain out the side. You can get breather setups for this if you prefer. You can run this tube somewhere else. You can plumb it to, you could drill and tap this for a connection. That's the most environmentally responsible way to handle that, so that your whatever's coming out of the crankcase ends up dropping right into one of the intake tubes and being sucked into the motor and combusted or dealt with that way. But however you want to deal with that is fine. What I'd recommend against is getting a small, just little, these little air filter. They look a lot like these filters, but they're small. You put those on here, and the problem is that gets saturated with oil. Once it's saturated with oil, there's nowhere for that oil to go, so it just starts dropping everywhere and starts spraying out and making a mess. So that's not ideal. So stay away from that. But otherwise, you're kind of free to do whatever. The biggest thing is you just want some sort of filtration on this, or some sort of routing, because if you just leave it open, you're going to get oil everywhere. This connection here is the thermostat, the flapper valves inside. Fully down, like I'm pressing, is the cold setting. If you undo this screw, it will snap all the way up, and that's the full hot setting. Once you get this in the car and running, you'll want to go for a drive, get everything up to full operating temperature. You're going to need a good 20-30 minute drive to accomplish that. Then get back in, make sure this is all the way up. So your car should be your engine should be fully warmed up, and you want your flapper settings to also be fully open at that point. It's basically as simple as just loosening this screw on the side. It's a 7mm wrench. Just loosen it until it makes sure that it has free enough to snap all the way up, and then just tighten it back down. That's all set. That all operates automatically, so there's not much you need to do other than that one setting. If for some reason this cable snaps or something breaks, again, with everything loose, it'll spring snap to the full hot, safe setting. Let's talk about the valve adjustments. These have chromoly push rods. The chromoly push rods don't expand as much as the aluminum push rods. So your valve clearances, when it's cold and you're setting them, you want to set them to 0 lash. You do the process just like a normal valve adjustment. It's just the settings, just the numbers that you're doing differently. So with 0 lash, to check them, you don't even put a feeler gauge because you can't measure 0. You want to get in there and just, if you can rotate the push rod, just sort of spin it. And sometimes that takes a little screwdriver and a mirror to see and a flashlight, and you're doing all this under the car, and it's kind of a pain. But if you can see that rod spin easily, then it's at the correct setting. As long as when you grab the rocker itself, like grab the adjustment screw and push it in and out, you don't want it to click, you don't want it to move. Feeling nothing is 0. Feeling just a slight little bit, you might be at 1 or 2 thousandths, and that's okay. But anything bigger than that, and you really want to start adjusting it. And the way to adjust it is just take a 13mm wrench and loosen the lock nut, and then I take a screwdriver to back out the adjustment screw, just in case it's a little bit tight, and then I back the nut off so it's not interfering with your setting, and then just with your fingers twist that adjustment screw, because you can only get so much friction on these little threads, and you're not really trying hard, so you don't need to pinch on it hard and really get at it. Just grab it, twist it. When it stops, that's 0. You're not trying to put tension on it. Just use those fingers, let them slip. When they slip, that's your setting. Hold a screwdriver to maintain the setting while you lock the 13, and that's how you do each one.